It began with a kiss and ended with blood. Palermo, Sicily. Easter Monday, 1282. The evening bells had just begun to toll. Families gathered outside the Church of the Holy Spirit, their laughter mingling with the scent of wine and orange blossoms. The people were tired, poor, but for one brief moment, they felt peace. Then came the French soldiers. Drunk on stolen wine and arrogance, they swaggered through the crowd like they owned it. One of them, a captain with eyes too bold for decency, reached for a Sicilian woman, lifting her veil, smirking as his friends laughed. The woman froze. Her husband, a farmer, clutched her arm, trembling between fear and rage. The captain leaned in, lips curling, and whispered, "A kiss for France." That kiss never landed. The husband's knife flashed once, a short, desperate strike, and the soldier's laughter turned into a gurgling scream. Blood splattered the church steps. The crowd went silent. For one heartbeat, no one moved. The soldier's body hit the ground. And then, the bells. They rang louder, deeper, as if the island itself was crying out. From the towers of Palermo to the distant hills, every bell answered. A woman screamed. A man shouted, "Death to the French!" It was no longer a crowd. It was a storm breaking open. Torches were lit, doors slammed, blades were drawn, and from that single act of defiance, vengeance was born. By the time the night ended, the streets of Palermo would drown in French blood. And before the night was over, an entire island would become a weapon. Before the blood, there were years of silence. Sicily had become a jewel in chains, ruled by Charles of Anjou, a French king who saw the island not as a land of people, but as property. His soldiers marched through villages like wolves in daylight. They took what they wanted, crops, gold, even daughters, and called it tax. The Sicilians worked the fields for bread they would never eat. They bowed to priests who blessed their pain. And when they cried to God, their prayers drowned beneath the laughter of their oppressors. For years, Sicilians had whispered their hate in silence, in markets, in churches, in the cold corners of their homes. They prayed to God, the voice says, but it was the devil that finally answered. One man, a blacksmith named Matteo, had seen his son whipped for refusing to salute a French knight. He had seen his wife dragged away by soldiers who called it entertainment. He hammered steel by day, but by night he hammered rage into memory. Every blow of his forge became a vow. Every spark that flew from the anvil was a piece of his anger, waiting for air. He wasn't alone. The whole island breathed the same bitterness. Women hid knives beneath their skirts. Priests whispered rebellion inside confessions. Even children learned to curse the French before learning to pray. The people of Sicily didn't plan a war. They carried it in their hearts. Every insult was a spark. Every lash, every theft, every scream, another ember waiting to burn. And on that Easter night, the fire finally caught. The sun was sinking behind Palermo's hills, bleeding gold across the domes of the Church of the Holy Spirit. The air was soft, filled with the hum of evening prayers. The people gathered for Vespers, the sacred hour of peace. But peace was only the mask before the storm. The French soldiers swaggered through the square, their laughter sharp as broken glass. They were drunk again, on wine, on power, on their own cruelty. One soldier, face red with drink, stumbled toward a young Sicilian woman kneeling in prayer. Her husband reached for her hand, whispering, "Stay still." The soldier grinned. "Let me see the beauty God hides." He pulled her veil away. She screamed. That was the sound that cracked the silence of centuries. The husband's knife struck fast, once, deep. The soldier gasped, eyes wide, then collapsed onto the church steps. Blood ran into the stones like spilled communion wine. For a heartbeat, the crowd froze. Even the bells seemed to pause mid-ring. Then, from somewhere in the square, a voice roared, "Morte ai Francesi!" Death to the French. The words caught fire in the air. The bells exploded into life, not calls to prayer, but calls to war. Their sound rolled through the city like thunder from one tower to the next. Doors burst open. Farmers grabbed sickles. Blacksmiths took hammers. Fishermen came with nets and knives. Even priests tore their vestments and lifted torches high. They didn't just fight for freedom. They fought to erase shame. The narrow streets of Palermo turned into rivers of vengeance. Women struck soldiers with stones. Children screamed directions. Men burned the barracks and dragged the bodies into the light. By sunrise, more than 2,000 French lay dead. By sunset, the number would double. And for the first time in centuries, the bells of Sicily rang not for God, but for revenge. The night of blood in Palermo was only the beginning. By dawn, riders were already galloping along the coast, shouting one phrase that turned every Sicilian heart to flame. "The French are dead. Rise up." The news spread faster than wind. From Palermo to Messina, from Catania to Syracuse, the island ignited. Villages that had been silent for years now howled with fury. Every bell tower became a war drum, every church a signal fire, every man a soldier. In Messina, a father broke open the prison where his son had been beaten to death and strangled the French warden with his own chains. In Catania, fishermen dragged French nobles from their ships and threw them into the sea, their screams swallowed by the waves they once ruled. In Syracuse, peasants stormed the governor's mansion, burning banners, smashing statues, and hanging tax collectors from the same beams that once held their debts. They were no longer peasants. They were executioners. And irony danced with faith. Priests who once preached forgiveness now blessed the blades of men. "This is justice from heaven," they whispered, making the sign of the cross as blood stained their robes. Smoke filled the skies for miles. The sound of drums mixed with hymns, of laughter with cries. Children sang songs of vengeance as mothers poured oil on the torches. The scent of burning flesh and orange blossoms hung together in the wind, the perfume of rebellion. French soldiers fled to monasteries, begging God for mercy, but the people surrounded them, shouting, "God has already chosen his side." Doors were torn open. Prayers turned to screams. No army commanded Sicily now. Only fury. For 8 days and nights the island burned, its fire seen even from the ships in the Tyrrhenian Sea. And when the smoke finally rose to heaven, the priests said it looked like incense. The island burned for 8 days, and in the ashes, a nation was born. In Naples, the news arrived like a dagger to the throne. "They've slaughtered every Frenchman." Charles of Anjou stood in silence, his wine trembling in the goblet. His court waited, pale and terrified. Then the king rose, eyes blazing, and whispered, "If they want hell, I shall bring it to their shores." The bells of France rang once more, not for worship, but for war. Ships were built, swords forged, priests promised divine vengeance. Charles swore he would erase Sicily from the map, salt its soil, hang its men, enslave its women. But the Sicilians would not kneel. Their blood had already turned to iron. They needed allies, and their plea reached the courts of Aragon across the blue Mediterranean. King Peter of Aragon listened carefully. He smiled, not with mercy, but with ambition. He saw opportunity wrapped in tragedy, a crown waiting for the bold. He sent his fleet, black sails cutting through the waves, not to save Sicily, but to claim it. And so began the War of the Sicilian Vespers, a storm that swallowed the entire Mediterranean. The sea turned red. Flaming arrows rained down from the sky. Ships collided in the night like beasts of iron. The air was filled with the cries of men, the crash of steel, and the thunder of drums. From the decks of Aragonese galleys to the cliffs of Palermo, vengeance spread beyond the island, an inferno carried by wind and pride. But every act of revenge has its price. Villages burned again, not by French hands this time, but by those who claimed to be saviors. Farmers became soldiers, sons became corpses. Women buried their husbands with bare hands, whispering the same prayer, "At least we died free." The war raged for 20 years, long enough for children born in blood to grow up knowing nothing else. And when the kings counted their dead, Sicily remained, scarred, starving, but unbroken. Revenge had given them strength, and now it demanded a price. The island had traded one master for another. The crowns had changed, but the graves stayed the same. In the end, when the sea finally calmed, a few old men stood among the ruins and said, "We fought not for kings, but for ghosts." The war was over. The French were gone, and Sicily was free. But freedom had the smell of smoke. The cities that once sang with laughter were now graves of stone and silence. Houses lay hollow, their walls blackened and broken. The fields where children once played were scattered with bones. The sea, once bright as glass, carried ash instead of light. They had won their freedom, but lost their innocence. In Palermo, an old woman knelt beside the ruins of her home. She held a rosary in one hand and a handful of soil in the other. Her eyes were empty, her voice barely a whisper. "We buried our oppressors, but we buried our sons with them." The bells of the churches still rang, but their tone was weak, not of triumph, but of mourning. The wind moved through the empty streets like a ghost, carrying the faint echo of screams long gone. Those who survived no longer spoke of vengeance. They spoke of hunger, of loss, of dreams that burned away in the same flames that had freed them. The island stood quiet beneath a blood-colored sunset, neither victorious nor defeated, only changed forever. They called it the Sicilian Vespers, but history would remember it as the night an entire island chose revenge over mercy. Fade to black. The last bell tolls once, low, distant, eternal.